Now, this hour, I'm asking you whether you feel constantly penalised as a motorist. There's just no point, is there? Especially you live in a big city. You can't park it. You can't drive in without paying some sort of congestion charge, ulez, les, this, that and the other. Traffic cameras everywhere, 20-mile-per-hour zones, car tax going up and up and up. I mean, what is the point? Let me know your thoughts on that. The number to call 03444991000, or you can message me talk plus your text to 87222. And here to discuss this in more depth is Alan Miller, who is co-founder of the Together Declaration. And Alan, you're often found at a ulez protest. What are you up to this weekend?
Well, this weekend I'm not going to be at a ulez protest. We are getting ready for our big 2-year anniversary, which is in Westminster, which is on the 29th of September. And we are working with people around the country, for instance, people in Cambridge that have just won the battle against the congestion charge. We're working with people in the Midlands who have been challenging the clean air zone. And in Scotland, where after 2 months of having the low emission zone, Glasgow pollution has gone up by 10%. So alongside the Mayor's Office trying to interfere with scientific reports, trying to hamper them, it's clear that the science and the evidence is not saying that any of these measures do anything for our health or well-being, but it is much more about limits and suffocation, surveillance, like you've talked about, Alex. So this weekend, I'm talking to people about that and hoping that many people come and join us on the 29th in Westminster. We've sold out downstairs. It's going to be couple of thousand people. It's going to be a big deal in the year of the general election, because we're going to send the message to the government and to the opposition and to everyone that the public need to be front and centre. Exactly agree with your democracy point of the demos.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting here because Rishi Sunak basically saying he's going to stick to this pretty hardcore target of 2030 to then ban all petrol and diesel cars. In the report on this, ministers are understood to have promised BMW that they would not relax the targets as part of negotiations to secure a £600 million investment to build electric minis in Oxford rather than China. Now, I fully support this government trying to make sure car manufacturing stays here. I really do. But why should it be the average man and woman who ends up having to pay for this? I mean, the target of 2030, that's just over 6 years' time. How on earth, come 2030, are the vast majority of us supposed to be driving around in electric vehicles, Alan, when, as far as I can tell, you can barely charge them anywhere? A lot of service stations, when they've got the sort of 10 charging standards saying we don't have enough base power in the grid to actually make them all work at the same time. And when you look at the number of cars on streets now, multi-car families, you can barely park outside your house. So how are you supposed to have the world's longest extension lead to plug this thing into your garage? I got no idea.
Well, a lot of really important points there, Alex. Firstly, technological development is really important and it should be encouraged and welcomed, and that can be really useful. But then you have to think about what's realistic and practical and not imposing mandates and measures on people, also spinning misinformation about it. So the thing about electric cars is there's a goal of 300,000 charging positions. There's currently 44,000. We've done about 3,000 in the last 3 months. That's very sluggish. People recognise that. It's also the case they're much heavier. That has implications for our roads and our car parks. They're much more expensive. That has implications for our costs and in the cost of living crisis. And they use all sorts of things like copper, obviously steel being forged. They use a carbon footprint to get made. They actually use double the carbon footprint, but people hope they can last longer. But there's a question about their batteries. Now, coming back to the point about British jobs, as it happens, lots of jobs are going to be lost in the transition to electric from coal-fired in some ways, if that is the journey that's gone on. But Rishi Sunak is not going to be around. He'll have to eat his words. It's not going to happen, Alex, right? What's going to happen is, now that people are waking up to realise that what the consequences of just making this platitude net zero really are, the consequences for jobs, for productivity, for in a cost of living crisis, for what it means in terms of power cuts, and not investment in core things that can deliver. All these things might sound nice when you're doing policy talk. Reality for people working up and down the country is not the case. So
the reality is we're just lining China's pockets who are burning coal in order to manufacture all this stuff that we then buy.
And also China's got the majority of cobalt as well. So, I mean,
Exactly. Don't get me started on the whole China and Africa thing. We touched on that a little bit in the first hour, and I'm bound to come back to it at some point because, you know, we've really tied our hands behind our backs when it comes to our foreign policy and access to minerals. I mean, I've had a heartbreaking message here. David in Staffordshire, who says, I'm disabled and I live in a council flat with no off-road parking and very poor public transport here. I rely on my car. An electric car would just be impossible for me as I've got no way of charging it at home and public chargers are few and far between. The government are ignoring disabled people with this push for electric cars and we need a rethink. David, I can't agree more. I think disabled people are awfully ignored all the time. We care more about made-up things like gender, you know, transitioning and all of that than we care about people who actually have physical impairments. My uncle had MS and was wheelchair bound, and him getting around London on the tube was extremely difficult. We still don't even have a proper underground system that looks after disabled people. So I really feel for you there. Alan, let's go on to what's been announced in Wales. I mean, this is just bonkers, isn't it? Mark Drakeford must be on some sort of wacky-backy. He's putting in place 20-mile-per-hour speed limits everywhere and then saying, well, if you break the speed limit, you're going to be fined £100. I mean, this is just utterly ridiculous. As far as I can tell, 20 miles per hour doesn't make much difference than 30 miles per hour. It's just really frustrating. But also, my argument is, he's saying this is going to save loads of lives because something hits you at 20 miles per hour, you're less likely to die or be maimed. OK, fine, I guess that. But if you have to spend your whole life staring at your speedometer because trying to stay within the 10% margin of 20 miles per hour is almost impossible, that, you know, you're actually going to have people not looking at the road, worried if they're going to break the speed limit and going all over the shop. I mean, this is just bonkers, isn't it, Alan?
Well, it is. I mean, the thing is, Mark Drakeford showed us what he liked when he locked down Wales longer, harder and faster than anywhere else, constantly using platitudes that we know were nonsensical around public health and what it meant. And we see the same thing here. People have quite rightly said this is going to devastate their incomes, their businesses, their ability to move around, delivery people, gardeners, a whole range of different people who work, who rely on getting from point A to point B. And this speaks to the question of mobility and freedom, Alex, and partly your last contributor, and it's true of people that are disabled as well as people who are not disabled, which is that it represents the freedom to make choices and to be independent, to run a business, to see family, to get around. The more that limits like 20 miles per hour everywhere, blanket rulings are put in just to fulfill a platitude, right? This is a bureaucratic platitude that's alleged to save lots of lives, and they use all these extrapolations. In fact, what it's going to mean is more surveillance, more fines, more restrictions. Some people are asking for one mile per hour over the speed limit, people to be fined.
Oh my, that's not even possible. You can't even make sure you drive. That's mad.
There's a war on cars. It's a war on citizens. And what it says is, we're the wrong type of people. It's the wrong type of movement. We don't like freedom. We don't like the ability to make our own choices. But ironically, they haven't sorted out the public transport issue either. So if we did have a really brilliant, efficient public transport system that got everyone around rapidly, a bit like in inner London, right? If it was like that everywhere and people had done that first, there might be some more merit or virtue in the argument for people. There'd still be an argument for freedom and mobility.
No, exactly. There's not a viable alternative. And, you know, without sounding a bit Me Too movement, and I'm gonna, as a woman, if I'm going back home late at night and I'm on the tube, I don't feel particularly safe. You get all sorts of weird, leering geezers looking at you. They're standing in the carriage, eyeballing you. When you get off and you're doing your walk home, you're wondering which odd pervert is following you down the street. I think a lot of women feel far safer when they're tucked up and secure in their cars. Talking about a women's view on all these driving regulations, let's have a chat with Anne in Hertfordshire who wants to join the conversation. Hi, Anne.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm sick and tired of where I live. I have to pay to go to Tesco's, I have to pay to go to another place, I have to pay to go to the hospital. Now, I've got to pay to go to the doctor's.
What, in terms of parking?
It's ridiculous. They put a parking machine at the doctor's.
I've always thought it's utterly criminal that people have to pay such high charges to go to a hospital, and especially when people work in a hospital. Why on earth? That is utterly mad.
Well, I feel sorry for the nurses that have to pay to park at the hospital, go to work. They have to go through these ulez zones, and they have to pay £45 a month to park at the hospital.
It's utterly mad. And do you know what? Someone got in touch with me on one of my previous shows who said that they were a carer. So they're going around as a district nurse or whatever, visiting people at home, making sure those people are fine. And they were going to have to give up their job because of ulez. I mean, that is just utterly insane.
Well, we went to the hospital last week because I'm disabled. I had a fall.
I'm sorry.
My husband's my carer, and the doctors took so long doing things. We were there for 7 hours. It cost me 17 quid to park my car.
That's insane. It's criminal,
disabled
frankly.
people aren't exempt.
Where does this money go? Right? Who's collecting this money? Is it private parking companies? I mean, where is it going?
I'd like to know who's getting it. The £17 to park my car was ridiculous.
Anne, thank you ever so much for calling the programme. If you want to be like Anne, the number is 03444991000. So, Alan, yeah, I mean, the other thing, just before we go to break, which I find utterly ludicrous, is now Sadiq Khan, with his dodgy science, is basically saying, oh, you know, this making it really difficult to drive your car is really good for your health because you get more pollution if you drive a car than you do any other form of transport. I mean, that's basically saying, I'm protecting your health by preventing you from driving. The man is a moron, isn't he, Alan?
He's talking absolute nonsense. So this is Sadiq Khan, who's flying out with several aides on a jet to the United Nations to talk about the climate crisis, funded by C40 cities, unelected, undemocratic, unaccountable, where they're basically making decisions to nudge and control and restrict us. He's telling us that he's doing it for our own good. He knows that the science doesn't support this, all the research that's come out. That's why they...
His department were telling people publishing scientific papers who didn't quite have his angle that they wanted them to basically redo it. I mean, it's just insane.